Good morning, I'm Dr. Joe Ramos here today with Joe LoRusso.
Morning.
We are partners in the Aviation division of Ramos Law, and we're here today to discuss the Dallas Executive Airport incident at the air show this last weekend. Terrible crash.
Yeah, tragedy.
Tragedy, collision between pilots that ended up in, I believe, 6 deaths, wasn't it, Joe?
Yeah, I think 6 is what they're reporting right now.
Occurred between a B-17 and a P-63. And Joe and I are going to discuss some aspects of the airplanes. We're going to discuss air shows in general themselves. And then I think we're each going to maybe take a stab at some things that are important in the investigation and what we would want to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so as pilots ourselves, obviously this is dear to our hearts, the loss of the lives of other pilots. A tragedy like this in an area that should not occur. And the question always is why? Today, I don't think we'll have a specific answer on a why.
Right.
But I was impressed. I was talking with Joe before we decided to do this piece, and he has such extensive knowledge of air shows and aspects of how these are run that, being a pilot myself, I didn't even know existed, that I thought it would be important to share those things. So the first thing I did was looked at these airplanes. I'm not as familiar with them as you are. I know you're familiar with a lot of these jet warbirds and such, right?
Absolutely.
Flown some of them yourself?
Absolutely. Yep.
And I'll share some specific just facts I found in brief. The B-17, known as the Flying Fortress, this particular one was November 7227 Charlie. Has a gross weight of 65,000 pounds. Top speed of anywhere from mid-280s to 311 miles per hour. The stuff I found said that this airplane cruises, though, surprisingly, as slow, I would say as slow as 150 miles an hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This particular airplane, 7227 Charlie, was constructed in 1944. It was put in service July 12th of 1945, and it actually spent time in both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy Air Forces, respectively. It stopped its service August 25th of 1955, and when it was stopped service, it had been flown 3,357 total hours. That's what was on the airframe. Now, is that a lot of time on an airframe, Joe?
That is, well, not on this airframe. It's typically a lot of time, but definitely not on a B-17. On a B-17, these things were, pure steel and rivets, right? Pure metal. So, yeah, it's not uncommon for a lot of these airplanes to stack hours.
And then I noticed another thing on it. After it had stopped its service of that 3,357 hours, it was actually sold and purchased. The Commemorative Air Force actually purchased this airplane in 1967 for $50,000.
Wow.
Yeah. Is it unusual for these airplanes to then be sold like that after their service?
No, that's how the government produced or recouped a lot of the war bonds back in the 40s, right? So most of these airplanes were purchased by pilots who flew them in the war. This airplane was in the Pacific Theater almost 50%, or excuse me, in the Atlantic Theater, in the European theater. And almost 50% of the bombs dropped in the war came from B-17s.
Wow.
So there were a staggering number of B-17s operating there in Europe, and a lot of these foundations, these groups afterwards purchased them. Same thing with P-51s, same thing with Stearmans, BT-13s, T-6s, you name it. I know P-51s at the end of the war were getting bought for $1,500, $1,000. So
incredible for such special and commemorative planes. And what's even more amazing, as I was looking, it says with regard to the B-17 that they estimate there are about 40 left in the world, and maybe as few as 5 that are still flying in the full capacity as this one. So despite the numbers, not maybe as many around still, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're a big undertaking to keep operating.
Wow. And then the other aircraft involved in this incident was a Bell P-63F King Cobra. Its tail number was N6763. That's November 6763. Now, in comparative, where that B-17 had that gross weight of 65,000 pounds, the P-63F here involved had a total weight of 8,800 pounds. Top speed of 410 miles an hour, so quite a bit faster.
Oh yeah.
And this one I found was very interesting. This particular aircraft that was involved in the crash was constructed in 1943, put into service in the same year, September 13th of 1943, a day before my birthday. And there were only 2 of the 63F models that they know of that were ever built.
Wow.
They said this particular 63F, so one of 2 here involved in this crash, had a much taller tail fin and a rudder for better control, they said. And this was really shocking. This one only had 24.1 hours of use, and they were all with the U.S. Army Air Force.
Wow.
Yeah. Surprisingly low, right?
Surprisingly low.
Yeah, it may have just been a component of when it came out and was actually put into service to maybe when those type of duties in the war then ended. In any case, the P-63F King Cobra involved in this started in air races as early as 1946. So this airplane, while it had very little time in the military, actually had quite a bit of time in air races. In fact, in September of 1946, this particular aircraft in Cleveland had an average speed of 346 miles an hour in that air race. That was pretty remarkable. And then also as part of my looking at these aircraft, I was looking for damage history or past flight history between the two, and I noticed that this P-63F King Cobra had an emergency gear-up landing in Midland, Texas in October 15th, 2013. So my question to you, Joe, would be, is there significance of a prior event? You know, this is an emergency landing, gear up, back in 2013. Does that affect your thinking at all in this situation?
Not typically. These airplanes are built to, certified back into flight with such a high tolerance and a high degree of professionalism that a lot of times previous events, accidents, incidents, by the time that airplane is reintroduced into service, I mean, we're talking about a brand new airplane, right? No residual mechanical effects or anything from a previous event. So, of course that could vary, but typically that doesn't bother me at all.
And and that's spot on to what I saw in the research of the aircraft. And aircrafts have such intensive maintenance schedules and such. There are pictures actually through a lot of the restoration of this aircraft on several events as it moved hands, and it's remarkable how much they, just in a restoration, how much they tear one down. Much less, I guess, if there's a gear-up landing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure this airplane got torn all the way down after that and put right back together, better than new.
And now the next thing I want to talk about here, and here, Joe, predominantly I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions here because you really opened my eyes to a lot of air shows themselves as I looked this up, again out of interest, being a pilot and going, what happened here? First thing I turned to were air shows, and I had called Joe up. We had exchanged some texts the minute we heard about this tragic event, and Joe said, "Yeah, I wonder what's going to come out about the details of the Air Boss." Just could you explain to me and to viewers, if you're a pilot, if you fly in air shows, you may know what an Air Boss is. I'm a pilot and I've flown a lot, and I had no idea what an Air Boss was. What is an Air Boss, and how do these shows work in that regard?
Yeah, so an air show is it begins from waivered airspace, right? So the airspace is protected. There's a waiver put out that doesn't allow your common pilots to come and go, right? That airspace is blocked off from everybody accessing it, so that the only people that are operating within that airspace are air show performers. Typically, if we look at this airport was an air traffic controlled airport, right? It had a control tower. Now in a control tower, you have the tower, you have the ground. There's a lot of communication coming and going from a lot of different airplanes. We found that in air shows, it's better to streamline that all to one person of responsibility, which we call the Air Boss, right? So the Air Boss will control ground movement, will control ramp access, and will control who's performing and when. So it all comes to one focal point, and whatever your boss says, that's the first and final authority in an air show.
Got it. Now, does this Air Boss, who's that authority, my understanding is there's some sort of briefing they do of the air show, is that right? Right. About what's going to happen on the particular day. And this was a 3-day air show, November 11th through the 13th. This incident happened on the 12th. Is there a briefing each morning that the Air Boss gives on how the show's going to run?
Absolutely. What people don't understand is there's a lot of practice that goes into these air shows as well, right? So there's an overall briefing that'll begin before even the practice days. Oh, wow. So that everybody gets an understanding of how the show is going to operate, how each practice period is going to operate, all the way through to the end of the show. And that is a very big briefing. Mm-hmm. And then from there we have day briefs, right? So, and then the day briefs are performed that morning, pilot only, with no crew, with no press or anything like that. It's just with the performers themselves or their designated representatives and the emergency responders and the Air Bosses team. And they brief the events for each day. As you get deeper into the show, if the show is a 2-day show or a 3-day show, the brief will include lessons learned from the previous day, right?
Oh, wow.
You know, as we introduce public, as we introduce weather events, you know, the brief might incorporate, hey, from yesterday we found that there's a lot of public coming in through this road. Maybe we avoid this area, or we stage ground crew at this area because of what we learned from the day before. So, yep, comprehensive brief at the very beginning, and then briefs throughout the show all the way into the end, where there's a debrief of how the show went for everybody.
And yeah, it's a level of detail, and as you said, even practice beforehand that I wasn't aware existed. And then my understanding as well from you is that the FAA, I understand, has put out particular orders or there are particular sections, that this isn't just willy-nilly from air show to air show. There's literally a set of guides that explain how that's to occur.
Absolutely, yeah. Within the 8900, there's a detail there, and that's the FAA order for flight standards for FSDO offices, for flight standard offices. And there's a chapter in there that specifically addresses airshow protocol. And then there's waivers within that chapter that are supplemented to that chapter. So you're exactly right. Long answer short, there is a very detailed playbook that needs to be followed for every air show.
Wow, and yeah, and as part of that playbook, you explained to me, and if you wouldn't mind explaining to the viewers today, you explained to me that there are particular lines, like there's literally corner markers that are placed in a particular area, and there's lines in particular areas that the pilots are aware of, and you mentioned that these lines and these markers and so on and so forth are there for really viewer safety. Could you explain a little bit about the show lines and what that means to you as a pilot or someone participating in these air shows?
Right, there's a bunch of different show categories. So some shows may involve aerobatics, other shows might just be demonstration of old warbirds, right? And so if we have aerobatics, which is obviously the most intensive, for very good reasons, the most intensive playbook, so to speak. In that case, we have what's called an aerobatic box. It's a designated area that is typically marked on the ground with physical markers. Sometimes it'll be tractors, sometimes it'll be cones, something that's visible from the sky, so that we have a set area where aerobatics can be performed in. And no aerobatics are performed outside the box. One, for show safety for the spectators, but two, for emergency response of the pilot. Right? The FAA has mandates that says that they have to get emergency responders at the scene of a crash within an aerobatic box within a minute. Wow. So if we control the scope of the show and the area of the show, we can respond to it much quicker. Now when we go into demonstration shows, that's when we lose the box a little bit and we start talking about show lines. And the show lines are designed exactly what you said, to keep the spectators safe and to keep the pilots safe.
Okay.
The lines will typically run, we have a 500 line, sometimes we'll have a 1,000 line, and the lines will run both laterally as well as vertically. Some pilots may have a low level waiver where they're able to come closer to the ground at very high speeds. Other pilots may not have that waiver, that specific training, so they'll operate on a higher show line. And then that line is broken down based on the speed of the aircraft, right? Faster, larger airplanes might be removed from the crowd. Slow-moving, smaller airplanes may be allowed to operate a little closer to the crowd with respect to their line and their safety from the spectators.
So are these lines set up this way, I guess because if there is a crash or if there's a debris field or something, it's set up to avoid that affecting spectators?
You're exactly right.
Okay. And in this particular tragedy, thank God, there were no spectators involved that I've heard of. Have you?
I have not heard of any either.
Yeah, so it sounds like in that regard that the organization of this air show seems to have done its job in that way, and that no one else was injured. There was, of course, that show out in Reno, Nevada, that we know about, that obviously there were many more spectators injured or killed than I think there were pilots.
Yeah, Galloping Ghost. Yeah, the P-51 that into the stands. Yep.
Yeah, I think there were 11 deaths in that, and one was a pilot or something, if I remember right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Joe, I also understood in looking at these shows and talking about the air boss and about the different crews, that the air boss who leads up the entire show, then there's usually team leads or crew leads that lead up the crew. So obviously there's several levels of communication. Right. In your experience and knowledge, what do you know about how that works, the communications with the again, the big boss, so to call it the air boss, and then the crew leads?
The FAA mandates that there needs to be a briefing, right? The air boss has to do a briefing. But air bosses throughout the country can perform that briefing to how they feel it would best convey the message and the safety. So a great example of that is if you have a very large show, right? Like the Dallas Airshow, right? Like the Dallas Airshow for sure, but also like the Chicago Airshow. That's a big one that people think about, or Oshkosh. Yes. In those shows, you may have so many performers over the course of so many hours and so many teams that it is just not beneficial to do a brief with every single crew member from every single team in that same room, right? You may have questions that, you're fielding an hour and a half of just pure questions from there, and you're not using your time effectively, nor are you conveying your message of safety safely to an entire room of that many people.
That makes sense.
Obviously, with a smaller air show then, and you have maybe 2 or 3 elements, 2 or 3 performer groups, in that case, it may be beneficial to have everybody in the room on the exact same page. So I'm unsure of how the Dallas got performed. I suspect with the size of that show that likely it was just flight leads. And that's a decision made by the air boss to convey, all right, this is what's happening this day with you, flight leads. Please go back to your team and brief the team. And at that point in time, it's on to the flight leads to effectively brief their team.
Okay, all right. Interesting. Well, and that's something we'll talk about here in the end when we go to maybe some guesses as to what could have happened or some theories here, which I'll just tell you right now, purely on our behalf, are just as pilots, as people with an interest, as people with intimate knowledge to air shows, just kind of, hey, I wonder about type of questions. They're certainly not conclusions by any means.
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to touch on before we each kind of maybe discuss the more controversial aspects of what could have happened or may have happened here.
Sure.
One other question I had was, you mentioned certificates of waiver or getting a waiver. Can you just elaborate that on a little bit? The waiver, I take it that it can affect things from the altitudes the plane can fly at or how they fly within an airspace. What exactly do the waivers cover and how they apply to these air shows?
Yeah, the FAA is big on waivers. The FAA loves waivers. Waivers at its purest form mean that you're asking for the ability to not do something, right?
Right.
So you're being waived from that regulation. You're being permitted to operate in that way that may be counter to how the regs are published. In an air show, we have waivers, one for the airspace. The airspace is generally open and accessible to anybody. The waiver there being, it's no longer open and accessible to everybody, right? So then we have waivers that go all the way down to the specific crews themselves. If we look at an aerobatic performer might have a low-level waiver, right? Those guys who come right down to the runway and pull out right at the last second and climb vertically, they have a waiver that allows them to get that close to the ground at those speeds, right? We may have speed waivers with the jets. We may have the ability to roll past 90 degrees. That may be a waiver. So all the stuff that you're seeing in air shows are things that the crews have performed, practiced, and presented to the FAA, the 3 Ps, that the FAA has granted them a waiver and said, okay, we believe that you're able to operate in that regard.
Interesting. And that'll be another, probably another thing that we talk at the end here, potential waivers in this particular air show. And then the last thing that, again, you really opened my eyes to when we spoke about this was this ability, if you're a part of a show, the knock it off call. I guess it is. Can you explain to the audience what the knock it off call is?
Knock it off call is a call that is universal from air shows. It can be said by anybody involved in the show. Safety observers on the ground, emergency crew, FAA representative who's required to be there at a show. The FAA certainly has the ability to knock it off. Performers themselves, let's say you're performing a show and something isn't right with the airplane, you can call knock it off, knock it off, knock it off. And what that is a absolute stop to the show. It's a complete ground hold. If there are people in the air, as part of all the briefings that I've been involved in air shows, if we hear a knock it off call from anybody and we're in the air in a holding pattern, that's immediately you're going to another airport. You're leaving the airspace entirely.
Wow.
So the knock it off call is very, very important, and importantly can be made by absolutely anybody involved in the show.
Yeah, that's impressive that you can have this many airplanes, this many pilots, the FAA, an air boss, an airfield, an airport, and yet they've thought through these air shows enough to even have a knock it off call to really try to ensure the safety of everyone involved.
And importantly, the knock it off call is never questioned, right? It's not knock it off, knock it off, knock it off. Wait, what's the reason? What's the basis for the emergency? That's not a factor into it.
It's just done.
It's done, and you're going to another airport, and when you're down and when you're landed, if you're in a holding pattern, you're calling people on the cell phone saying, hey, why did we knock it off? But you're not doing it in the air. It is an absolute stop, no questions asked.
Wow, yeah, really impressive, and that it's been thought out to that degree. That was surprising to me. So let's actually end today with the hardest part. The hardest part, besides the fact that there's loss of life of our fellow pilots and an industry that we treasure and we value, and we understand the importance and the safety of. Outside of that, I think I'd like to, respecting that is, I guess, how I would word this best. I'd like to take a stab at maybe some questions that we have after having seen what we've seen so far. Granted, it's very early. This is, a couple days old. Really nothing's been released except for a bunch of press on it. And I know we don't draw our opinions from the press.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. But as pilots and as understanding, I think you said, was it FAA, the 8900 order and different aspects that would affect a show like this. I had made kind of a, hey, Joe, do you think this happened type of a guess. I think that maybe you had a couple thoughts, and I wanted to share those if you don't mind. So in studying air show patterns, I realized that they put different airplanes, as Joe explained prior, into particular types of patterns. So for example, you don't have a B-17 flying steep banks and climb outs and high speed maneuvers, and on the other side here you might have the P-63 flying a more aggressive pattern or something more impressive to the spectators, and you've based distances from the crowd on speed, on performance, and so on and so forth, but there are these respected patterns. And one of the patterns I had seen was this reverse banana pass pattern, and we'll show that here for you guys so you can see what a reverse banana pass is. And it looks to me like it's a fairly aggressive arc that comes in towards the airport or towards the show line, as you've described as the lines, and then comes back out. There's also another pattern that's flown frequently in air shows called the flat pass, and it's where the airplanes, again, we'll show you an example here of what a flat pass is, but where airplanes come by in a straight line, I guess probably the lesser performing aircraft.
Sure.
When I had seen this, one of the first questions that popped into my mind is, gosh, was this P-63 performing the reverse banana pass at the same time that the flat pass was being performed by the B-17? What are your thoughts on that?
It's certainly a possibility. It certainly could be a possibility. Historically, as you know, I operate an old World War II airplane as well. I've been air showing for 10 years now, which is crazy to think. But a lot of times in these shows, when we have a lot of vintage warbirds, the goal is to immerse the public in that experience, in that environment, right?
Yes.
So in the war with the B-17, you had large, massive groups of 17s, and then you have escort fighters, right? And the escort fighters were the 51s and the P-40s, and so it's a big effect at air shows to have a bunch of these old round engines spinning, making noise in the air, and really let the public look up there and see, oh my gosh, this is what it would have been like in the war.
What it felt like.
This deafening noise and all these airplanes. It's an awesome show done right. And there's a couple of different ways that I've seen it performed, and I've been a part of it performed, is we'll take slow movers, right? Slow movers, and we'll run them in a racetrack. And then we'll start stepping out from category and class, right? So maybe trainers in the center, and then we'll step out to the P-51s, and then from there we'll step out to the heavies, and the heavies are less maneuverable, like you said, right? You're not gonna have a B-17 doing wingovers in front of the crowd, right? You're maybe gonna have them just do that slow progressive pass through, let those 4-round engines just make deafening noise. At the same time, you have the fast movers come through, and everybody wants to hear that Merlin engine,
yes.
That Allison and that Merlin engine in that bank, right? Because that's when you get the wah, right?
Right.
As that prop's biting a bunch of air going up. So it's entirely possible that they had the B-17 coming in on either a flat pass or a wide show pass, and then run the fast movers. It looked like the 63 was following a couple of Mustangs, some P-51s. So maybe he was following that P-51 trail and doing exactly that, doing reverse bananas and really getting that airplane to bite some air and make some noise. I think you're right. I think it certainly could have been a combination of those two passes mixed in together at the exact same time.
Now, from what you've described, and I think you mentioned this to me when we were talking, when you kind of gave it your pilot intuition, if I wonder if this happened, you'd explained to me, and again, this is my layman's way, despite being a pilot, but my layman's approach to air shows of thinking about it. You described it almost, it was like a target with like rings, and I think you've kind of alluded to that here a bit. There's almost like, if I understand it correctly, to say, are there rings that they keep the different aircraft at? And so is another possibility, not that one is doing a flat pass and one's doing this reverse banana maneuver at the same point, same place, by some misfortune, is another possibility that they were all in a pattern and somebody just strayed wide in their lane, so to say? It's almost like running a track meet and you accidentally take the corner and you get out in the other lane?
Sure. Two big things when you're doing those airshow passes is one, situational awareness that we call SA. So when you're part of, for example, let's take that 63 following two Mustangs. It's very easy in a racetrack pattern to see, off your right, you got a B-17. In front of you got a 51. To your left, you got a Beech 18. To his left, you got a Stearman. It's very easy to lose that SA in the midst of all these airplanes. And it's a challenge to stare at the back of a 51 in this case and say, that's my guy, I'm following his track. And to paint his extended line and to constantly keep your airplane in his extended line and make that SA all the way around with him. So it is entirely possible that potentially somebody lost their SA, maybe the 63 lost their SA of that 51 and drifted out. The other aspect of that is you're a performer, right? You want to show that engine off. You want to show that airplane off. You want to give the people on the ground a good show. So you're constantly, as you're coming around, stepping that power up, taking a bigger bite of that air, and by perhaps maybe too big of a bite, and that energy, that kinetic energy, just flowed that airplane into another racetrack. That's possible as well. In that case, there's not a whole lot you can do about your SA, right? You're watching that 51 while you're sliding to the outside and still watching that 51. And that residual energy, that motion that you put into the airplane carried you into another racetrack.
And again, we're talking here about aircraft, as I said earlier, that the P-63, in this case, the King Cobra, top speeds of over 400 miles an hour. So can't imagine that kind of drift or push you could get.
Exactly.
As you said, as part of performing. So I guess in wrapping up today, some of the things that come to my mind that we would want to know as part of this investigation, and as more information comes out here in the future, I think one of those I can think of from the top of my mind is one of the first things you mentioned. What was the air boss doing? Not to say that he's wrong or right, just what was he doing? What was the briefing that day to the pilots, the teams, team leads? Who was briefed? What was that briefing that was given? And how was the air boss organizing basically the timing, the patterns, and how it was to occur? That would be something that would pop to my mind in the investigation that we want to know. Is there anything that jumps out the front of your mind?
I would hit on every single one of those. I think it's going to be curious to listen to the actual frequency. On frequency, the goal is air boss is the one who's talking. Air boss owns that frequency, right? They own the sky, the ground, the taxiway. They own everything. Okay. So the air boss, when we're doing race circuits like that, you're getting constant feedback from the boss and his team, right? So if we come around, perchance maybe the King Cobra, the 63, maybe his last pass was a little low, right? And you listen to the tape and you hear boss say, Cobra, pick it up on your next one, right? Or Cobra, slow it down on your next pass. Or you're getting those constant adjustments from your air boss to make sure that each pass is appropriate and each pass is to the brief and safe. So that's going to be an interesting tape to listen to afterwards.
And is there a chance, another part of this investigation, in addition to the air boss and the tape, there's a certificate of waivers? Is there anything particularly there you think might become of interest?
Yeah, so in this case, as we've talked about in our previous videos, we're going to have two parallel investigations running, right? The NTSB is going to run their investigation talking about fleet safety, air safety, right? Are there things that impact air shows moving forward? Are there mechanical things that would impact other P63s? I know when I say other 63s, those of you at home know there is no other one. But other 17s that would impact the safety over the course of the fleet. The FAA is going to look at, did we do everything right from a regulation standpoint, from a piloting standpoint, from a waivering standpoint, right? So all those waivers are going to get pulled, all the medicals, the pilot's medicals, pilot's hours, certificates, everybody involved. Were all the teams certified to the way that they said they were certified, right? In their waiver applications. Yeah. That's where the FAA is going to be looking and directing their focus in this investigation.
Yeah, it's interesting the amount of data and information that's kept. We're also going to show you guys here towards the end of this a little bit the patterns that they've flown. That'll be an obvious part of what comes into the investigation, and we've got some really good footage here, or a diagram, some images of kind of the patterns being flown. I think that from the patterns being flown, if we speculated about that, would probably be unfair to either pilot, I would say. How do you feel about that?
Agreed.
Yeah,
agreed.
It's interesting to see their paths that they flew and what they were doing, but anything, for us to say anything more than that, I think would be pure speculation. And then, Joe, is there anything at all that you saw in any of the film footage, I mean, that would, let me say it this way, would you be surprised if there was a knock-it-off call in this particular incident?
I'm sure there was a knock-it-off call. I'm sure, given where they impacted each other, I'm sure that knock-it-off call came from Airbus.
So knock-it-off call probably unfortunately after the tragedy, rather than before it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that'll be another part of the investigation. I think that we'll be interested in seeing what comes out of it.
Yeah.
Anything else you have to add that we've missed?
I think I'd like to echo just at the very start, the warbird community, the flying community is a very tight-knit community. And of course, every single one of these that we deal with, both from a legal standpoint as well as just from a pure piloting standpoint, is a tragedy. And especially within the warbird community, this is a big loss with the 17 and its crews and the 63 and its crew. And our heartfelt thought and prayers go out to all of them.
Absolutely. I'd echo the same thing. So thank you again for watching today. We'll have some follow-up that will come out on this, and we'll see what other questions have been answered that we haven't brought up today. We'll maybe find out what some of the answers are to the questions we've brought up, and look forward to sharing with our pilot and viewer community.
Absolutely.